Oh, hey. I didn't see you come in there. Do you want to learn about comic books? Fantastic. Let's go back in time to when comic books began in the early 1930s.
As you can see, America at the time was in very bad shape.
Can you sign this, mister?
Sure, kid. Stay in school. After the stock market crash in 1929, New York had to face the Depression. Thousands of people lined up at soup kitchens just to get a basic meal. People created cheap entertainment to occupy the troubles New York citizens were facing. One quickly growing industry was comic books, as the stories portrayed immersed people in the fantasy rather than the harsh reality. These stories were mainly about crime and detective work, and originated as comic strips from local newspapers.
Noobs. 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 This changed quickly, and comics became stories of their own, creating new characters with complex plot lines. Noobs. 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 During the 1930s to the 1950s, the comic book industry had erupted into what historians call the Golden Age. During this time, superheroes such as Superman and Batman, created in the late 1930s, pushed out crime and detective comics and became the popular read amongst children in America.
Did you know that many comic book characters were created by Jewish immigrants?
Tell me more!
Well, it's true. In fact, most of the big names in comics were written and drawn by Jews.
Joe Shuster and Jerome Siegel created Superman, Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman, and Stan Lee created X-Men, Fantastic Four, Hulk, and Spider-Man, just to name a few.
Most of these writers and artists were second-generation immigrants who lived in New York. The Golden Age stimulated comic book interest and had many readers hooked to its stories. During the times of World War II, many comics had incorporated the war into many of their issues, having their heroes fight Nazis or other military studying the U.S.
This brought a shift in comic book styles, from crime detective work to heroes saving the day for the average citizen. A lot of comic book heroes had arisen during this time. One of the most famous was Captain America, who in the first issue was depicted punching Adolf Hitler in the jaw on the front cover.
These comics became a very powerful tool aside from the media because the writers had the power to convey any messages they wanted in their comics, which would later be read by millions of children inspired by the heroes in which they read about.
After World War II, the need for a hero amongst the people wasn't as interesting to Americans, simply because it didn't relate to their lives anymore. This is when comic books reverted to crime and violence as a way to attract the youth. These comics had a tendency to be graphic and obscene, and came to the attention of many people who were worried that the new generation was being poisoned by these stories.
One of the most frightened people criticizing comic books was Dr. Frederick Wortham from New York City, who believed that comic books were corrupting the youth.
He theorized that the comics they were buying were bad influences that turned them into juvenile delinquents.
He later published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, criticizing the comic book industry for being a bad influence on children.
Hello? This led to an uproar as adults began to fear the very comic books that their children were buying, and led to a self-censorship that the comic book industry created to legitimize their safe comic books.
What are you talking about? This code, known as the Comics Code Authority, set up a guideline to us what comic books could and could not do.
As you can see, the comic book industry took the code very seriously, as the majority of their fan base depended on the youth whose parents would only let them get comics if their Comics Code Authority approved.
January of this year, the last comic books publisher left the CCA, leaving the Comics Code Authority powerless.
Which is a good thing because my comic books aren't censored.
Relax yourself, kid. Back